President Trump recently announced new tariffs of 10% on foreign softwood lumber.
Oh, not this again.
He also announced additional tariffs of 25% on certain things made from wood, like kitchen cabinets and vanities, and upholstered wooden furniture. These tariffs went into effect on October 14, 2025, and there's a scheduled increase to the kitchen cabinets and vanities and upholstered wooden products tariffs of 50% and 30% respectively that will kick in on January 1st, 2026. Trump said that these new wood tariffs are necessary to shore up America's local industry and support national security. Here's what he said in the executive order itself. In my judgment, the actions in this proclamation will, among other things, strengthen supply chains, bolster industrial resilience, create high-quality jobs, and increase domestic capacity utilization for wood products such that the United States can fully satisfy domestic consumption while also creating economic benefits through increased exports. So here are the questions that we need to answer. First, what do these new tariffs mean in the context of the other tariffs that are already in place? Second, what do these new tariffs mean for lumber prices in the US? And third, will these tariffs work? Will these tariffs actually help the US lumber industry? Well, let's get into it. In March of 2025, President Trump ordered the Commerce Department to perform a review of how timber, lumber, and related wood products impact U.S. national security. And as part of that review, the Commerce Department determined that an over-reliance on imported wood products means that the United States may be unable to meet demands for wood products that are crucial to the national defense and critical infrastructure of the United States. These newest tariffs are a direct result of that finding. But there are already a ton of lumber tariffs already in place, as well as general tariffs on a whole host of items in a whole host of countries. So what do these new tariffs mean in light of what is already in place? Well, for that, we need to quickly touch on the current status of lumber tariffs. Now, I've talked a lot about this topic in the past, and so I'm not going to go into all of the nitty-gritty ancient history, but it is important to know that we've had tariffs on Canadian lumber off and on since the 1980s. And every president since Ronald Reagan, both Democrat and Republican, have placed some form of tariff on the import of Canadian lumber, with the sole exception of Bill Clinton. So lumber tariffs are not new. What is new is that President Trump is not just placing tariffs on Canada and not just placing tariffs on lumber, but on nearly every product from nearly every country. The current tariff on Canadian softwood lumber is around 35%. And Canada is actually exempted from these new tariffs on softwood lumber because they already have high tariffs. But they're not exempted from the tariffs on furniture and cabinets. Those are new for Canada. Now, of all the lumber that we use in the United States, we import about 30% of it, and we produce about 70% of it domestically. Of the 30% that we import, about 40% comes from Canada. So they're definitely our largest trading partner as it relates to softwood lumber. Our next largest imports of lumber come from China, Brazil, Mexico, Germany, and Vietnam, as well as a number of other European, Asian, and South American countries. The lumber tariffs for each of those countries varies, but what's important to know is that this new tariff on lumber, cabinets, and furniture is in addition to whatever other general tariffs may already be in place for each of those countries. For example, the current tariff rate on Mexico is 15%. That's on nearly all goods coming in from Mexico. And so in this case, softwood lumber imports from Mexico will have a tariff of 25% total. That's the 15% general tariff plus the 10% new lumber tariff that was just put in place. Here's what the rest of that list of major importers looks like. Now, any simple analysis like this is difficult because there's a ton of nuances, and so the exact numbers are going to vary. For example, some countries have exemptions, other countries have caps, and the rates seem to be changing all the time. Additionally, these new tariffs are placed on softwood lumber, and some of the countries on my list of major importers are actually importing other lumber products like plywood and not necessarily exclusively softwood lumber in large quantities. And so some of these new tariffs may not necessarily apply to those other lumber products. So like I say, it can get complicated, but the point of all of this though is that these new lumber tariffs make foreign lumber and foreign lumber products in general more expensive to buy here in the US. So how does that translate into actual prices? Well, that is a great question. And here's the thing. While these tariffs are new, we've had tariffs in place for months. And there seems to have been very little impact on retail lumber prices. In fact, here's my graph of retail lumber prices over the past year or so that I've been tracking. And you can see that while there have been some fluctuations, lumber prices have, for the most part, stayed fairly steady. Now let's look at a graph of lumber futures. You can see that it shows much more volatility, but to be honest, this graph may actually be a little bit misleading because of how it's formatted. It may look more volatile than it actually is. And so let me just zoom out for a moment and include a few other years where volatility was much higher, and it becomes evident that these prices have been pretty steady for a while now. So what's going on here? Now, the conventional wisdom is that lumber tariffs would increase lumber prices, but that's not what seems to be happening. And I have a few insights as to why that might be. First, it looks like some companies are eating the cost of imports, or at least a portion of those costs. And so that is definitely part of it. But that isn't sustainable in the long term, and that could change in the future. The other thing that's happening is that lumber buyers are turning to domestic supplies of lumber that don't have these tariffs, which is kind of the whole point of the tariffs to begin with. The biggest reason, though, as to why lumber prices may not have increased through this time is demand. Housing starts are near a 5-year low, and so there simply has not been a lot of demand for lumber. And when demand is low, people are less willing to pay high prices for lumber, and so that is what's keeping things down. Now, that could change if the housing market picks up, but you tell me if you think that's likely to happen in the near future. And I've predicted that if it does pick up, we're actually in for a world of hurt because a lot of lumber mills have shut down, and so that kind of constricts supply. And so if demand were to kick up and really take off, there may not be enough supply to supply that demand, and that's when you would see a lot of these cost increases. But again, that's not what we've been seeing up to this point. But the whole point of these tariffs is to make imports of lumber more costly, which would then encourage domestic production and domestic consumption of lumber. So the big question is, will these tariffs work? Will they bring back the American lumber industry and American lumber jobs? To really understand that, we need to talk about an economic concept known as protectionism. This is an economic strategy where governments impose barriers, things like tariffs, quotas, or regulations to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. It's had mixed results historically, with notable successes in industrial development and failures in efficiency and global competitiveness. The whole point of protectionism is to preserve domestic jobs, support emerging industries, safeguard national security, and reduce trade deficits. All things that the Trump administration is trying to do. Protectionist policies can also be a negotiating tactic, meaning that some protectionist policies can be used as a bargaining chip and removed in order to strike deals and get better terms. There are many examples of when protectionist policies have actually been effective. A great one is South Korea in the 1980s, when they placed huge tariffs and quotas on foreign vehicles from the US and Japan. They also gave out low interest rate loans and tax breaks to their domestic car companies, and these policies created a captive domestic market that allowed their car companies, their homegrown car companies like Kia and Hyundai, to grow and become internationally competitive. Protectionist policies can also backfire, though, and the major risks include higher consumer prices, reduced innovation due to less competition, retaliation from other countries, global isolation, and distorted resource allocation, meaning that capital may flow to inefficient sectors due to artificial protection, and that's not good for the economy as a whole. Some examples of when protectionist policies have failed include the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was passed in the 1930s, which raised tariffs on over 20,000 different goods, triggered global retaliation, and worsened the Great Depression.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the Anyone? The Great Depression, passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression.
Another example was Argentina in the early 2000s. Their protectionist policies led to higher inflation, reduced foreign investment, and overall economic instability. So how will these protectionist policies over lumber work out for us? Well, before I give you all my take, I want to know what you think. Do you think that we're going to end up more like South Korea in the 1980s or Argentina in the early 2000s? Leave me a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I always love how thoughtful you guys are, and I love reading and responding to your comments. So please let me know what you think. Now, in my opinion, I think this is actually a little bit too early to tell. Trump hasn't even been in office for a year, and a lot of these tariffs have only been in place for a short period of time. But to be honest, I'm not really that optimistic. In the lumber industry, I don't think that our protectionist policies are going to lead to more jobs, mainly because mills and factories are moving towards more automation. They can do more with less. And so while there may be a lot of investment, I don't think that it's going to translate into a lot of new jobs or benefit lumber communities in the same way that the mills of the past did. Secondly, while lumber is a renewable resource, logging can have a devastating impact on the landscape and can spoil areas of natural beauty. And the Trump administration is expanding logging to some formerly protected areas, and that is going to have some significant negative environmental impacts if we don't do a good job. Lastly, for a protectionist policy to really work, it has to be targeted and it has to be part of a cohesive plan. And as I see it, and feel free to correct me in the comments if you think that I'm wrong, there does not appear to be any kind of cohesive plan around these lumber tariffs or around tariffs in general. We're just placing ever more and ever higher tariffs on goods coming from other countries without much thought on how it may impact supply chains. There doesn't seem to have been any thought on the time that may be needed to build new infrastructure, new factories, or the retaliation and isolation that may come from these aggressive trade tactics. Again, to this point, I don't think that enough time has passed yet for us to really see a lot of the negative impacts of these policies, but I fear that those negative impacts are coming. Again, feel free to correct me if you feel that I'm wrong, but that's my overall read of the situation. And that isn't to say that there can't also be some positive impacts. There may be some good things coming out of this, but the question is kind of the good versus the bad. How much good are we going to get out of it and how much bad is going to come from it? And that's definitely something you have to consider and think through. And I don't think there's been a lot of thought put to that. There is one last thing to discuss on tariffs, and that is the Supreme Court. Trump bypassed Congress to put the tariffs in place by invoking the International Emergency Powers Act, or IEEPA. If you recall, Trump's initial reasoning for the tariffs that he put in place on Liberation Day was fentanyl trafficking. That was the emergency. A case right now is working its way through the courts arguing that the tariffs are illegal, and multiple lower courts have agreed. The Supreme Court is set to take on the case this November, and if it stands, it will give the president far more power over the US economy. But if the Supreme Court rules that these tariffs are illegal, then the tariffs would be rescinded. While that decision would apply to most of the tariffs, including these newest tariffs, it likely would not cover the current 35% tariffs on Canadian lumber, as those were done under a different authority. Definitely something to watch out for. So to recap, new tariffs over softwood lumber, cabinets and vanities, and upholstered wooden furniture of 10% and 25% respectively were put into place on October 14th. These tariffs are in addition to already existing tariffs and will increase the price of these products, although that doesn't seem to have happened just yet. And there is a pending case before the Supreme Court which could throw out most of the tariffs or keep them in place and give the president more power over the economy. Whatever happens, I'll be here to explain it to you, and so be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next one.